Welcome to the integration session, where we explore the science, stories, and future of psychedelics. I'm Dr. Elena Koning, and today I'm very excited to welcome Sarah Rodan, a researcher from the InsideOut Institute for Eating Disorders in Sydney, Australia. Sarah recently completed her PhD at the University of Sydney, where her research focused on novel pharmacotherapies for eating disorders, including cannabinoids and psychedelics. She now coordinates a clinical trial in collaboration with Imperial College London, investigating psilocybin for treatment-resistant anorexia nervosa. Together, we discuss Sarah's background, key findings from her impactful survey research on drug use in eating disorders, the hectic realities of clinical trials, and her vision for broader access to psychedelic treatments for the patients who could benefit most. Let's dive in. Hello, Sarah. Welcome to the integration session. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, all the way from Australia.
Yeah, a long way,
Yeah.
very far away. What's the time difference between?
Yeah, so it's 7 p.m. here, but on Wednesday. So there it's Thursday. So it
Not.
just boggles my mind.
Yeah, that's pretty insane.
Yeah, but I'm excited to chat with you because, as some of our listeners know, I'm also in the field of eating disorder research and psychedelics. So I think we'll have a lot of interesting things to chat about. And I've definitely seen your work before this point. So I'm excited to dig a bit deeper into that. But for those who may not know you, can you just walk me through your professional journey? So, how did you get into eating disorders? How did you become interested in psychoactive substances as potential treatments? And how did you get to this point in your career?
Yeah, so it was, I guess, a bit of like an unconventional like route. I was initially like, I was very like artistic, and I wanted to like be an artist. And anyways, I was at school one day, and my chemistry teacher, I mean, her name was like Miss Whitby. She put on a docu. I was 17, and I had no intention of going into science, like none at all. And she put on this documentary on LSD, and it's one of those I think, everyone who's interested in this field has probably seen that documentary on like YouTube. But I remember being utterly fascinated that you could take this tiny amount of a substance, or LSD, and it can completely change your like perception of the world, and you see all these colors, and that was like so fascinated that something like that like existed. And then as the documentary went on, they kind of presented this case where they were investigating LSD for cluster headaches. And this father, he was being interviewed, and he was like, "Oh, I mean, cluster headaches are really horrific, painful, thing to go through." And this father was like, "I promised my kids I would never do drugs, but he was suffering every day, and they were having quite good like effects." And I didn't understand that either. I was like, how can there be this substance that could potentially relieve someone from their pain, but because it was like an illegal drug that they couldn't have access to that? And I think that stayed with me for like a long time. And quite quickly after that, I became really interested in, I guess, novel compounds like cannabinoids and psychedelics, and kind of, I guess, their history of, people not having access to these medications or medicines, even though there's evidence to show that it can help. So that stuck with me for a while, and pretty quickly after that, I was like, I'm not quite sure what I want to do, but I'm fascinated, by altered states of consciousness and psychedelics. And then as I got older, I saw, women in my entourage that, had an eating disorder and were really quite unwell. I saw the impact it had like on their family. And I got to a point where I was like, well, why don't we, has anyone even looked at like psychedelics and eating disorders? And at the time, I think this was like, 10 years ago. And at the time, I couldn't really see any research that was being done in that field. So I was like, well, this hasn't been, looked at before. We know that there's efficacy, like preliminary efficacy at the time in like depression, like OCD. If it's showing efficacy in these conditions, why would it not be effective in something, like anorexia, which is often comorbid with depression and OCD? So that's kind of how it started. And I was initially interested in like LSD as a potential, and I still am interested in LSD as a treatment for for anorexia. And hopefully down the line, I'll look into that a bit more specifically. But LSD is a 12-hour long drug. Psilocybin is it's shorter duration, it's a lot easier to manage in terms of time frame, and a lot more research is being done with psilocybin. And that's kind of how I got into like psilocybin in anorexia. Yeah, so that was my journey. And then back, I think now you can do courses where you're just looking at, psychedelic treatment. But, I did I did an undergrad in chemistry, and then I did a master's in neuroimaging. And I was just hoping to get onto some form of project where I could do psychedelics and eating disorders, but it wasn't happening. And then so I was like, right, well, I guess the next step for me is a PhD, because there's no other way I can do this work. And it took a very, very long time to find the PhD. And it's actually one of the reasons I moved back to Australia, was because I found someone who was willing to supervise me to do that work. But that study didn't get started until recently. So yeah, it's been a long road to get into this field. But yeah, it's kind of how it was started.
Interesting. Yeah. So where did you live before Australia?
So I'm half French. So I was born in France, and then I grew up in West Australia, and then I moved back to France when I was a teenager, and then I moved to the UK for uni. So I did all my my undergrad and my masters in the UK.
Okay.
And then I was planning on staying in the UK. I was initially looking, for work in the UK, or to do a PhD in the UK, but that didn't happen. And then I was really like, honestly, I was even going to give up. I was like, I can't, I want to do this PhD in psilocybin and anorexia, and I can't find anyone who could be willing to supervise me. And then Professor Ian McGregor, who's the director of the Lab Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics, who's a big figure in cannabis research and policy in Australia, he was like, I'll be happy, to supervise you. And so I came over here, and then we collaborated with the InsideOut Institute for Eating Disorders. So yeah, it was a long journey.
Cool. Yeah, and you've recently completed your PhD, so
Yes,
congrats
yeah.
on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I
That's
can't call
huge.
myself a doctor yet, but I'm just waiting for like the confirmation letter. But yeah,
Oh,
everything's all
soon,
been
yeah.
done now, but very soon.
Yeah, that's
Very soon.
exciting. And yeah, so
Yeah.
now you're working at the Inside Out Institute. So how was your PhD experience? So was your PhD project, you said that you weren't able to do that trial at that time, so was it focused on cannabinoids?
Yeah, my PhD was, yeah, because I wanted to do psilocybin in anorexia, and when I first started, we couldn't get funding, for the study, and so at the time, Ian, my Professor McGregor, he was like, well, why don't we look at CBD in anorexia? So I kind of took on this to set up that clinical trial. But then 6 months down the line, there was a grant made available by the Australian government, like an MRFF, and for innovative like mental health therapies. And like the kind of topic was, psychedelics. And so we thought, why don't we apply to this grant, and maybe, we'll get funding to do this study. But it was quite last minute, and um, we then reached out to Imperial College London. So I believe the study is completed now. I don't think the results have been published. Where they just were doing psilocybin for anorexia, and so we collaborated with them, and they were like, we are really experienced, with psychedelics here at Imperial, but you guys are really experienced with eating disorders. So if you use the same study design as us, maybe you'll be able to bring something to this kind of work because you're so experienced with eating disorders. So that's kind of why the collaboration took place, and then so we submitted the grant, the application. We got the grant to do the study, but it was a Schedule 9 drug in New South Wales, Australia. Setting up a trial for that, it was many, many hurdles. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. So it took us like 4 years to set up. So I spent most of my PhD getting that study up and running, hoping it would start during my PhD, but that never happened. And so I was getting this very complicated study up and running, and then I was getting a high-dose CBD study and anorexia up and running. And that was very difficult as well, because we were giving up to 800 milligrams of CBD a day to people with anorexia in the community. We were sending the drugs, to their homes. So very like novel protocol. There was quite a few hurdles with that as well, and recruitment. We had initially hoped to give high-dose CBD to young persons with anorexia, so between 12 to 18 years. And they had to be doing family-based therapy for the first time, which is like the gold standard kind of psychological intervention, for young people with for anorexia. And we couldn't recruit anyone, which, looking back on it, it does make sense. Why would families refer their kids into this trial when they're just trying this, I guess it's considered the gold standard, but only 40% respond based on the literature. Why would they refer their kids to a novel drug when they don't even know if they might work for them, So they weren't really willing to do that. And a lot of the young people, even if the parents were motivated, the young ones were like, I don't want to take that medication. So we opened the criteria from 12 to 69, and they could be doing any form of therapy where they had to be monitored. They had to be receiving psychological support. And then we gave high-dose CBD as an adjunct, and we gave them CBD for 3 months. And so, that study only started recruiting finally like 9 months before I had to submit my thesis. So I spent all my PhD getting that up and running. So that was hard. I wouldn't recommend getting 2 novel clinical trials up and running for your PhD. But I got there, and that study is actually done now. I finished recruitment, hoping we're preparing the manuscript now. Some pretty interesting findings. And then I guess the other part of my project was this huge survey that I did. So it was an international survey. We recruited people who self-reported having a clinically diagnosed eating disorder or disordered eating. And we thought there's nothing helping these people, so why don't we ask them what works for them and what doesn't? It's kind of like a basic idea, but we really didn't expect to get the numbers that we did. We recruited, I think it was like 7,000 people from 83 different countries. And so it was unexpected that study turned out this monster of data collection. The PhD was hard, I'm not going to lie. And I think it definitely wasn't the plan to be having these 3 massive projects, for my PhD. So I really, really wouldn't recommend that. And I learned so much in such a short period of time. But yeah, it was hard. I'm not going to try and pretend like it was easy. It was a hard time, yeah.
Well, it sounds like you had a lot going on at that time. It's very impressive to still get the PhD done when all of that's happening. Clinical trials never go to plan. So.
Never. And I was so naive. I was like, oh, everything's going to be great. Everything's going to work out. And now, that's changed. I'm definitely like, everything can go wrong, and I expect everything to go wrong.
That's good. Nice. Yeah, and you mentioned the survey, and I really want to dig into that because that's where I first discovered your work, was that paper. So I would love to chat about that. So like you said, you examined prescription and non-prescription drug use in people with eating disorders. So what were some of the specific insights? So what prescription and non-prescription drugs were people using with eating disorders, and what did you sort of make of that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This was, honestly, I really didn't expect. I had an idea I'll just maybe give it a little background, because I guess we put this survey together because I was like, I know for a fact that people are taking psychedelics in the community for the eating disorder and self-medicating. I knew it, from people around me. I knew it from like forums, but how could I put it in a context where that evidence would be respected and be like, okay, this is, good science. So I was like, how do I do this? And so I thought, why don't I just ask people who haven't eaten? In this survey, it is self-report, which is a limitation, but I think some of our findings are actually consistent with the literature. So even though it is a limitation, I think that kind of balances it out. Why don't we just ask people who have an eating disorder or self-report if they're using psychedelics and if it's helped them or not? And then we were like talking about it, and then we thought, well, why don't we just ask about every single drug? Why don't we ask about all the illicitly sourced drugs, all the drugs prescribed by a doctor, your legal drugs like caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, because we know that prescription medications are widely prescribed, in people with eating disorders, even in anorexia, where there is no really any clinical evidence to support that prescription medications can be effective with the treatment of anorexia. They can be effective with the treatment of, comorbid conditions like depression and anxiety, but not for anorexia. So, what are they? And they're being prescribed these medications, but we don't know. There's no qualitative or anything of how they think these medications are effective for them. So, we wanted to get that information and compare between all the drugs and all the types of eating disorders. And so I guess the only 2 medications really which are unapproved for an eating disorder is your lisdexamfetamine for binge eating disorder, which is FDA and TGA approved, and fluoxetine or Prozac for bulimia nervosa. And that's what we found in the study, that for those that self-reported having bulimia nervosa or binge eating disorder, lisdexamfetamine and fluoxetine were the most effective drugs for specifically treating eating disorder symptoms, which was and really fascinating. But apart from that, prescription medications were not effective, for treating eating disorder symptoms specifically, because we had these kind of three core questions to which we compared all the drugs. It's like one, this statement, this drug improves my eating disorder symptoms, and we had a bit of like some context with that in the survey, being like, this means it reduces maladaptive behaviors, not helps maladaptive behaviors, just to make sure that they understood that. And then this drug has overall benefits for my mental health, and then this drug has unpleasant side effects. And on I think it was like a 5-point Likert scale, they had to like strongly agree to strongly disagree. And so lisdexamfetamine very effective for bulimia, binge eating, and fluoxetine for bulimia, which is what we know already from the literature. But otherwise, that was it. And then the other drugs that showed efficacy were psilocybin, LSD, and cannabis. LSD was actually the most effective, was self-report for people who reported having anorexia and bulimia. Unfortunately, at the time when we did the survey, we didn't ask for the primary diagnosis. We asked for all the diagnoses they'd ever been given. And this meant that sometimes we had these like multiple diagnoses, but we actually didn't know currently what diagnosis they had. So that was another limitation of the study. But we still had enough of a pool to have like a significant number of people, for example, within each group. But for those reporting both AN and BN, LSD was the most effective. They self-reported for treating eating disorder symptoms, and then psilocybin was just effective across the board for everyone. So we looked at those that said that they hadn't received a clinical diagnosis for the eating disorder, but they had symptoms that caused significant distress, anorexia, bulimia nervosa, anorexia and bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, other specified feeding or eating disorder, and ARFID, so avoidant restrictive feeding and intake disorder. And psilocybin was effective for all of them. But for your restrictive and aversive eating disorders, like just anorexia and for ARFID, cannabis was the most effective, which was really, really interesting and not what I expected. And again, like I knew, and when I thought back of it, I knew of people with restrictive type eating disorders using cannabis, quite a lot, but I didn't, which makes sense. I mean, I guess, cannabis increases the hedonic pleasure of food. So it makes sense that someone with an restrictive and aversive type, that could be helpful. But for some reason, those were our key findings for specifically eating disorder symptoms. And if you literally look at the heat maps in the manuscript, it's like everything is red, apart from cannabis, psychedelics, and then lisdexamfetamine and fluoxetine. But then for our next part of the manuscript, which was, this drug has overall benefits on mental health, our prescription medications were very effective, and often sometimes more effective, than psilocybin or LSD and cannabis, which, this is what they are approved for. So, that does make sense. But it just really shows that you can prescribe these medications for overall mental health, but they really aren't going to touch the eating disorder symptoms and maladaptive behaviors, of that. That was really fascinating. And then for the side effects, I mean, psilocybin was rated really favorably in terms of side effect profile. Cannabis, not like yes and no. And then prescription medications, it was like a mixture as well. But I think, really those key findings were people with eating disorders are self-medicating with cannabis and psychedelics. And I mean, we have all these amazing open-ended, so they had an option if they wanted to give a bit more information about their use of cannabis or psychedelics. And so we have this incredible pool of data of like all these, comments from people describing, how they took a dose of psilocybin and they realized basically, I mean, I'm summarizing it, but they realized why they got sick, and then they were able to work on that and get better. Like some really profound comments. And it was interesting as well because anorexia nervosa is not considered like the most prevalent eating disorder. Usually binge eating disorder is. But in our survey, the most prevalent eating disorder was anorexia nervosa. And I mean, I hypothesized that it's because nothing works for them. And so when they saw the survey being advertised, they're like, I'm going to share what I know because nothing works for us. So Yeah, it was
Yeah,
pretty
it's so
amazing.
interesting and so important too to tap into that underground or recreational use of psychedelics because there's so much information there and that's like lived experience. Like that
Exactly,
matters
yeah.
so much in research. So yeah, I really love that you guys did that survey.
Yeah, and I mean, like, how can we, why has no one just gone to ask people, what are you doing? Like, what's helping you? It seems like
Mhm.
such a obvious idea in a way, but it's not. And I think as well in research and it's like, oh, like placebo control, like statistical significance. But I think especially in this field of psychedelic and novel drugs, like this qualitative part of research is so, so important and listening to that lived
Mhm.
experience is, but it's still as valuable. Um, so yeah, we were all like honestly blown away by the results of that. And I
Yeah.
think, I mean, it just gives so many ideas for future research. I mean, after there are no approved medications. I mean, there are, is it eight feeding and eating disorders recognized by the DSM-5, and only two have an approved pharmacotherapy.
Mhm.
ARFID, which is there are no approved medications. Like we found that cannabis was incredibly effective, which there's an aversive to food, so it really makes sense that that could be helpful. And we had comments of people saying like, my family all agree this is the only reason I'm alive today because this is the only reason that helps me to eat. And I just think clinical trial right there, like someone needs to be doing like a case. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
hoping I'll be doing that.
Yeah.
But I think there's just so much information to guide future research, and where this information is coming from lived experience, it's coming from people who are struggling with an eating disorder, not, I guess, researchers coming up with an idea without that contribution. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great. And the study was so rich that, like you said, and we had a different call before this, that it actually led to another publication. So that was the MedFed survey, right? So that was published in, I guess, last year, right? In
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
eating disorders. Yeah. So what stood out to you there about well, first, how did that differ from the previous publication? And what stood out to you the most about reported benefits specific to psychedelic drug use?
Yeah, so yeah, that was, I guess, the JAMA Network Open paper was like the master findings. But
Mhm.
like there was all this like qualitative information as well that we really wanted to report on, and like so that's, I guess, where the psychedelic paper in Journal of Eating Disorders like came out. That we really wanted a manuscript with all this additional information that we couldn't fit in a JAMA Network Open paper because like the word count is like 3,000.
Mhm.
So that was like, yeah, that was really fascinating, like reading through all the comments. And I guess the really, really key themes were people were describing as the use of psychedelics like as a defining moment in their recovery. Like they took this like substance and they were able to realize like, oh, like I developed these behaviors because I wasn't processing the grief of a family member, and they had this like click in their brain, and then they were able to work on that, or they finally felt self-love for the first time, and they then wanted to care about their body. They felt connected to themselves, to their friends, to their body. Like connection to body was a really big theme as well. And I mean, in having an eating disorder is so isolating,
Mhm.
especially like in anorexia. Like you don't go out for food with friends because you're scared of what is going to be available to eat. And we have these people being referred to our study as well, and like they're so isolated. Like they don't have friends, they don't have family members, and I think that you can take, and it's helping you to connect to others, but also to the world, can be really, really, really therapeutic. So like connection was a really big theme that we found, and I guess like if you do look at previous, literature in qualitative studies in psilocybin, even like the ayahuasca study by Adele Lafranc. I mean, these themes are kind of common in there as well. And we also found people saying that they found their use of psychedelics more effective than prescription medications. So they were actually finally able to come off all their medications, or we even found, and this is like really interesting, and I think a study needs to be done on this. But some people, they would take like a macro dose, like a larger dose, and then they would microdose for a few months afterwards, and that would help prolong the effects. So, which I think was a really, really interesting idea. And not many, I think two or three reported that. So that was a thing that came up. And then there was a lot of microdosing as well, people reporting. Some even found microdosing more effective, which again kind of makes sense in the context of anorexia. There's this there's this immense fear of losing control, and I guess starting slow and low could potentially be more, therapeutic, in that group.
Mhm.
Another key finding from that paper, I mean, what other comments? Like connection, yeah, insights and realizations, which I went through. But a defining moment in recovery were like transformative, like themes that represent like a transformative experience were like highly, prominent. Like the majority
Mhm.
of comments were really positive. We,
Yeah.
obviously did have some quite negative reports, like some really, really horrific ones. Not a lot, a small percentage, but that really does stress the importance of, if you are going to take a psychedelic, you do it in a clinical setting, supervised by,
Mhm.
clinicians. Because I guess in a recreational setting, it can be very dangerous, and especially if,
Mhm.
I know, especially if you're struggling, with some mental health, like you can be even more at risk. But
Mhm.
we did, I think, two people did report of, and not everyone who said they used psychedelics completed the open-ended comments as well.
Mhm.
I think it was like a third. I think we got 200 comments. I think we got 200 comments overall, and 1,000 people had used psychedelics in the survey, something like that.
Mhm.
But we had two people report that they had increased suicidal ideation afterwards. We had a few reports of like, they had a really bad trip and they couldn't eat a full meal for nearly a year. It's like really like
Mhm.
scary stuff, which I
Mhm.
think, it's good that we have that information.
Yeah.
Even like, in the context of what we're doing, it's like it's very like it's in a clinical setting, experienced clinicians, and we, in part of the screening and preparation, we do everything that we can in integration to mitigate, anything like that. But
Mhm.
it does show that things can really go wrong.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
and
if
when
you're not,
we're sorry, yeah, I was just gonna say, like, when we're talking about this research, and it's obviously so exciting for these populations, but it is important to also highlight those cases because it kind of balances the rhetoric.
yeah,
Like, it's like,
exactly,
okay, not everyone's gonna benefit from this, and we need to be
exactly.
aware of that, and that's why screening is a thing, and that's why we're doing research on these things in controlled and medically supported settings. So yeah, I'm really glad
Yeah.
that you guys touched on that as well in the
Yeah,
paper.
and I think it's important. And I remember, yeah, and I think as well with like the media and all these documentaries that highlight these
Mhm.
compounds as like they're going to cure the world. And I'm like, stop. Like,
Yeah.
I think, they have immense potential. Otherwise, I wouldn't have spent, the past decade, focusing on like just this. But I think we really do need to highlight that these drugs, they can really hurt you,
Mhm.
if things aren't done properly.
Yeah.
But I still think the fact that from what we found in the survey that, and look, this isn't all confirmed, and it's all like self-report, and so there's so many limitations. But I think we're all aware of that. But what am I trying to say? I think the fact that people could use these drugs as well in in a recreational setting, which I don't recommend, they were able to have all these benefits as well, which I think is
Mhm.
pretty amazing.
Mhm.
That they and another, I guess, interesting thing we found. So there's a lot of ketamine and MDMA is also being shown now to potentially have efficacy, the treatment of anorexia, and we know ketamine is effective for treatment-resistant depression and MDMA for PTSD. But it was interesting because in the survey we didn't find an effect there, of self-report use of MDMA or ketamine and like the perceived efficacy of that. And maybe because these drugs, well, those drugs, I mean, all these drugs have to be used in a clinical setting, but I just found it interesting that didn't come up, when they are being, used in this group now. So I thought that was like an interesting, yeah, I don't really know why that is, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely like a hypothesis generating study, that's for sure.
Yeah,
It really
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's the perfect way to put it. Yeah, it's just,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But
Yeah. And I want to turn to what you're sort of working on now because that was a big part of your PhD, but you're also doing some exciting things now in your work. So
yeah.
you're currently coordinating a clinical trial of psilocybin treatment for treatment-resistant anorexia nervosa. So I would love you to talk a little bit about the mechanisms here. So what is this treatment targeting in treatment-resistant cases specifically? And what was the rationale for doing this clinical trial?
Yeah, so for this study, it was a collaboration with Imperial College London. So I guess the core study design is, they put that, study design together, and their protocol, I think it's by Meg Spriggs, has been published. So you can find that in the literature if anyone, wants to go look at that. So our primary outcomes and the core study design are the same. So they get 3 doses of psilocybin spaced 2 weeks apart from each other. Participants are single blind, so they don't know their dose they're getting on the day. Only the maximum dose they receive on any given day is 25 milligrams. But we know the dose they're getting, but I can't share that because we're recruiting. And then, they have preparation beforehand, integration afterwards, and it's like a 6 to 8 week study. And our primary outcomes are the same. So we're looking at changes in the eating disorder psychopathologies like the EDE and EDQ, and then also in the readiness and motivation to change questionnaire and seeing if that predicts improved, outcomes, for eating disorder like behaviors and symptoms. And then for everything that's secondary outcomes, we've got quite a lot of differences. And I guess our study is different in the sense that we had to make it feasible to do it here, in Sydney, Australia. So I guess the difference is that in our studies that they have to be referred by a care team into the study. So if they are on medications, they have to be referred by, that require discontinuation for the study, they have to be referred by a psychiatrist. But they also have to be under the care of a psychologist or someone providing psychological support, which could be a clinical psychologist or a dietitian. And they have to be seen them regularly throughout the study. So we need that to consider them, and they also need to have a support person, which is so important for safety. But at the same time, like I was saying before, they're so isolated, by their illness, and sometimes they don't always have a support network. And how can we say no to someone who could potentially benefit from this, but they don't have a support network? So there's this line of like, but it might not be, even if we did do that, it would be potentially putting them in danger because they wouldn't be able to go home and have a support network. So that's hard. But they need to be, picked up, by their support person, and we maintain contact with their support person throughout the study. It can be a next of kin, like a family member or like a friend, and we screen them as well. So yeah, it's 3 doses over 6 weeks. We're also adding, and then we've got follow-ups up to 6 months and 12 months, but these are all like remote follow-ups. And then, so I guess what was I think the thing with sort of like and I think, even when people are coming to us, they're like, I'm stuck. I can't get out of this, they just can't break patterns. They don't have flexibility. And I honestly swear everyone that we've screened, like they literally say this, I'm stuck. And this thing that we know about psilocybin, it enhances neuroplasticity, it enhances cognitive flexibility, and it gives people a window to potentially get out, of that, those patterns and belief systems they just can't turn off. Their brain is like constantly do this, do that, and I think that's where, especially in these treatment-resistant cases, where they've been, so far everyone that's referred to us, they're severe and enduring. They've had anorexia for at least 10 years, and when you've been sick for that long, these belief systems and patterns, they are so ingrained. They're so it's like their brain is like a rock, and we hope that psilocybin is going to, maybe turn that rock into a bit of liquid, just a bit of a window so they can like break out of that, or, even like sometimes they even just like, I want to get better, but I don't even know how to get better. And if, when we have that window of flexibility, so in addition to the support that we give them, but then they're seeing this psychologist, they can then potentially maybe work on something they can't get to because, they're so stuck, but now they have this, window of like flexibility, and we do ask them to see the psychologist at least weekly, if not fortnightly throughout the study, so that we're trying to tap in as much as we can into this like window that they have. So I guess that's what we're really hoping. We're just hoping that it's going to get them unstuck,
Yeah.
And that's what they're all hoping as well. When we ask them, like, why do you want to come into the study? They're just like, literally that. So I think that's where I feel the mechanisms are. And I think the mechanisms of connection as well. And maybe realize some of them are even like, I don't know why I have this, and maybe psilocybin can be a tool for them, like, oh, actually, I've figured it out now. And now that they've figured it out, they can like work on that. And there's that paper by Stephanie Peck, that in was it San Diego? I can't remember. But they did I think like two of their participants like relived, an assault while they were under the influence of psilocybin. I remember like one of them, the comments, they were like, I was then able to work on this and then I got better. They were able to realize where this all started. And I think that's so important, as well. And that was a really, really big theme in our MedFed survey. So I think connection, like these insights, realizations, but also this flexibility is where like, I think mechanistically is why psilocybin can be so effective, in
Yeah.
treatment-resistant cases.
Yeah, and you talked a bit about the outcomes, but will you be measuring some of those things? So like a measure of like connection and cognitive
Yes. Yeah.
flexibility. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
We'll be measuring all of that.
At what
And
time
like,
points will you have like a long-term follow-up as well?
yes, we've got our last follow-up is 12 months after
Okay,
the study. Yeah.
nice. Yeah.
So, yeah. So I'm hoping they'll complete all the follow-ups. But yeah, and I think even just, being nicer to themselves. Sometimes, when people report when they're on psilocybin, there's a bit of self-love and be like, oh, I want to take care of you now. And a lot of them, there's a lot of self-hate and shame. And, that's really, really like tough. And potentially psilocybin can help, with that as well. So
Yeah.
I really think there's so many, and, it's not going to be the same thing for everyone. Someone might need that connection to help them move forward, or they might need that insight. But there's all these different mechanisms where psilocybin has shown, potentially that's what's driving, the effects. And I think there's just so much room for people, this can be potentially really helpful, but, it could also potentially be not right for them. And, so it's definitely not for everyone. And we
Yeah.
screen out, those that we think, wouldn't be safe.
Yeah, yeah, and you touched a little bit on the psychotherapy aspect, but just so I have that right, so it'll be general psychological support during the dosing, and then they'll be seeing a psychologist once a week, like throughout the process?
So they have 3 sessions of preparation prior to the first dose. So it's like getting to know one another, building like therapeutic rapport, and helping prepare them for the study. A lot of them, the practicalities of it is really difficult. It's like I usually eat at this time of this day, and now I have to eat at another time, and that can be like really, really hard. So just kind of helping them to plan that. What am I gonna do to try and make it work? So there's a lot of that involved in the preparation as well, and getting comfortable like in the room. I mean, some of them, there is compulsive exercise and they're exercising hours every day, and now we're asking them to lie down in a bed, for 6 hours. That is really, really hard. So it's just, I guess, going through all of that and, how we can best support them, for this day, which is potentially going to be really, really difficult. And so, yeah, on the day they lie there, they have the music playlist, the therapists are there to provide support. I mean, at present, we're not seeing like a lot of talking throughout the trip, but it's usually that talking start happening the next day for like the integration. Sometimes they're a bit raw. So the next day, like the integration, and then they have another integration a week after that, like a 2-hour remote integration. And then in between those, we do ask them to see their psychologist throughout. So yeah, so preparation, integration, not that much during the dose, but I mean, if someone needs that, then of course, the clinicians will provide that. It's all, we've only completed 2 participants, enrolled our next 2 this week. So it's all very preliminary for us.
Yeah.
But
That's
yeah,
exciting. Yeah. Well, best of luck with that trial. It's
thank you so
very
much.
important work that you guys are doing, and I'm really looking forward to seeing. I'll have to have you on again, and we can chat about the
Yeah,
results.
when we're done in like 2
Yeah.
years or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so as we're sort of like wrapping up this conversation, I want to talk a little bit about how you see, like looking forward, how you see psychedelics fitting in and potentially in eating disorder care. So do you think that'll be like an option only for treatment-resistant patients? Do you foresee somehow psychedelics fitting into conventional care for all patients with eating disorders? What does it look like for you?
Oh, I mean that sounds like, the best case scenario, what you're saying, but and I hope that one day these treatments will be more affordable and accessible. And it's always like, I find it like interesting, like these like the definition of like treatment resistance. So, I mean, obviously, like, I mean, for our study, for example, treatment resistance is defined as like, at least 3 years of administration, at least 1 failed treatment. But, if someone still has to be on medications to help them, for me, that's still treatment resistance in the sense that they can't come off their medications, otherwise they relapse. So I think I really hope that anyone who is struggling with an eating disorder could have access to something like this. But I mean, the cost, it's very expensive. And so, is it a thing where we do group therapy sessions or group integration or group preparation? I don't know if that would be effective, in this group. But I would like it to be affordable, for people to access. I mean, the current cost, so in Australia, you can get prescribed psilocybin for depression and MDMA for PTSD, and a psychiatrist can prescribe that. But the costs are hefty, like not everyone can afford that. But then if you look at hospitalizations and anorexia, I mean, the standard hospitalization cost is if not more, than what it would cost to do a course of psilocybin or MDMA. And potentially after that, maybe they get better, they don't have to come back to hospital. So there potentially could be a cost benefit, in that context. But I do hope that it can become available to all eating disorders, not just anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, ARFID, anyone who is really struggling. But I think, I mean, there's a lot of criticisms when the TGA made it, available by prescription, in Australia, because, this is too fast, we don't know what we're doing. But at least they did it, and there was a bit, now everyone's I think it's, it's a lot, I know multiple clinics now, where they're offering this treatment. And I think it's amazing because there are some people, they're really, really stuck and they're really, really sick. They've tried every treatment under the sun. They've done all these types of therapies and nothing's worked. And so I think it's really providing people a different option, who've exhausted all treatment options. But especially in context of anorexia, a lot of these, protocols that you need to be medically stable. You need to have a support network. And a lot of people with anorexia, they aren't medically stable. They're in and out of hospital, or they don't have a support network. So there's this gap in healthcare where they're too sick to get treatment, which is honestly insane if you think about it. How can you be too sick to receive treatment? So I really hope that there's going to be ways for those that fall through the gaps, where they're not well enough to access treatment, that they will have access to these therapies as well. And we hope we can maybe try and do something about that. So access to everyone who needs it, and obviously who is safe to do it. Not, it's not definitely not for everyone, but yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. And where do you see your own work sort of fitting into that picture? So you're doing this clinical trial now, but what are you hoping to work on after that? Or is that too far ahead? You're like, I'm just trying to make it through this clinical trial now.
I guess like you say, this, the MedFed survey was a hypothesis, driven thing. I have so many ideas and so many clinical trials that I'd like to run. So, I think, a lot more studies with psilocybin. I would love to do a clinical trial with LSD. I think there's something I'd really like to do some research on LSD and anorexia and bulimia nervosa, and then cannabis as well. So I guess I want to do lots of studies, but I do hope that one day, I don't know, we can have a clinic where we prescribe these treatments for, because even though if we do make it that even those that are medically unwell and in and out of hospital, we can give them access to these medications as if it's safe. That they can do it in a context which isn't too hospital setting. It's an environment where it's still a hospital, but a comfortable environment, to use these substances, to give these medicines. So, I guess more research and I guess helping access, I suppose, is where I hope that my career will evolve to. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I look forward to seeing all of these studies being conducted and sharing all these insights. I'll be following along for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, but thank you so much for joining me for this. It was really fun to talk to you, and
Thank you so much for having me.
of
It was
course.
great to chat.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning into this conversation with Sarah Rodan. I'd like to thank the Center for Psychedelics Health and Research at Queen's University and the support of our sponsors at the Ontario Brain Institute, the Canadian Biomarker Integration Network in Depression, and Providence Care Hospital. Until next time, be well and integrate wisely.